So last night I saw Weapons, and this movie is so good. I felt like I was watching a classic from the 90s or something. It's incredible. And of course, after doing endless research on the super symbolic design of this movie, I want to break down the meaning of every character, reference, dream sequence, theme, and symbol in this movie. And I'll be using a lot of quotes from the filmmaker and the actors to ground this analysis as much as possible as we go from the very beginning of this movie all the way to the very end. So to break this movie down, we're going to use three themes. One, cruelty of loss, where we'll discuss the inspiration for the film, the director's childhood, the director's alcoholism, and the loss of his close friend. Two, contagion of tragedy, where we'll discuss the purpose of the character chapters, Justine's character, the symbolism of the children's disappearance, the reason for 2:17 a.m., the alcoholism and addiction, Archer's character, Paul's character, the symbolism of the needle stabbing, and James's character. And three, spirit of grief, where we'll discuss the symbolism of the witch Gladys, the bell, the triangle, the pointed arm run, the number 6, Justine's nightmare, the clown makeup, Archer's nightmare, the gun in the sky, the title of the movie, Marcus's character, Alex's parents, and the entire ending of the film, and so much more. So hope you enjoy. Theme number 1, cruelty of loss. So for us to properly deconstruct all of the complex characters and bizarre details in this movie, we'll need to start with a few words straight from the writer-director of the film, Zach Cregger, on the tragic event in his life that inspired him to make this film and how that shaped the film. Trevor Moore, who I was in my comedy sketch group with, died very suddenly and terribly, and I was going through it. So I just sat down just to start writing, just to engage with my pain in a way that was not destructive, but constructive. So I wasn't sitting down to write a movie. I was sitting down just to write, to soothe myself. I mean, literally, sentence by sentence, I'm discovering the story as I go. It's a very personal movie. I don't have a statement. The movie's not political to me. It's a completely introverted kind of diary entry. So of course, in that interview, Zach doesn't give us a concrete answer on what the movie is trying to tell us or what the big message is about, but that's really the point. Rather than to send out a specific message, the film is actually constructed to represent his mind at a time of grief. The film is a personal release, just like a diary entry, as he says. So now, having established the inspiration for this movie and the overall purpose, I now want to get into Zach Cregger, his relationship with Trevor Moore, and his history with alcoholism. Just so that when we go through the film, we can tie those characters and details back to his real life, just to give those obscure symbols some real tangibility. So, musician and comedian at the time, Zach Cregger, met comedian Trevor Moore to form a group called The Whitest Kids You Know in 2000, along with 3 other members. Cregger and Moore developed a brotherly relationship, hosting, writing, and starring in live comedy shows, films, and TV series for over 20 years. But suddenly, on August 7th, 2021, Trevor Moore passed away. It was an accidental fall from his balcony in LA, suffering blunt force head trauma. And very importantly, later on, the toxicology reports indicated alcohol was a contributing factor to the fall. Cregger didn't resort to alcohol after the death of his friend, but he was an alcoholic in the past. Fortunately, he has now been sober 10 years. And this addiction, as it often is, was intergenerational. Cregger grew up with an alcoholic father. And I promise you, all of this personal history will come back around as we go through the narrative of the movie. So, having now just given you the thematic purpose of the film and the personal history that inspired the film, let's get into the characters and really dissect what each of their segmented chapters represents. In theme number 2, Contagion of Tragedy. The characters in this movie have a massive thematic purpose, and there's a big reason why the chapters in this movie are specifically separated and dedicated to each of the 6 characters. And I want to pull a quote from Josh Brolin, who plays Archer, to tell us why. When I met with Zach, after I read the script, he told me that every character is based off a certain reaction that he was having to a very traumatic event that happened to him. So in this quote, Josh highlights how Zach wanted each of the characters to represent a specific personal experience he was having after the death of his friend, Trevor Moore. And this quote really just reinforces the idea that by us watching his film, we are stepping into his mind and now meeting those 6 different emotional experiences, each separately personified. And this is a bit of a weird comparison, but it's kind of like Pixar's Inside Out, but dramatically more dark, complex, and personal. So let's explore each of those 6 characters, starting with Justine. So Justine represents Zach's experience of shame when losing his friend Trevor. These kids going missing clearly represents the suddenness and unexpected nature of Trevor Moore's death. Trevor was reported to have died in the middle of the night at around 2:30 a.m., which is reflected in the time these children disappeared, 2:17 a.m. It speaks to the cruel unpredictability of death, how death can blindside us at any point in the day, at any stage of the person's life. So while Justine obviously isn't to blame for these mass disappearances, just like when we lose someone very close to us, that feeling of guilt and shame is inevitable. It causes us to reflect on our personal flaws, past mistakes, and influences on that person we lost. And clearly from this film, we know Justine has a history of bad decisions that we learned from Archer at the police station. Since Zach was an alcoholic 10 years ago, for some period while he was friends with Trevor, and Trevor's death had to do with intoxication, it's possible he couldn't help but draw the connection and feel some guilt, as anyone would. And to take this parallel a step further, Justine resorts to the bottle to numb herself from these intense feelings of shame and pressure. And to clarify, Zach didn't drink to get over the death of Trevor Morris because he was sober, but it still has that loose thematic tie-in of his challenges with alcohol throughout his life. Archer represents the blame and resentment. He demonstrates the false solution to your grief of finding others to push the accountability onto. It's a circular, endless pattern, which is symbolized by Archer's dream sequence when he is running in a straight line away from his house, but somehow ends up back at his house again. It's this illusion of progress, and we'll talk about Archer's dream a lot more later in the video, but I want to pull a quote from Josh Brolin himself on his character. I think he's taken everything on himself, and I think he's exhausted all possibilities. He's a total control freak, and he's not winning. He's not making any headway whatsoever. And I think the fact he blames Justine, he brings his enemy close, thinking she may have answers. I think he's just utilizing every bit of control that he can muster in order to win in the end. And I think what ends up happening is he kind of breaks, and he realizes he actually misses his kid, and he's sorry that he didn't reveal during that relationship how much he loved him. And as I said before, we'll get into Archer and Justine's dream sequences later in the video, which will relate a lot to that quote. But for now, I want to get into Paul's character. Paul represents the feeling of defeat and discontent. Like Justine, Paul has battles with alcoholism as well. Paul is newly sober and has now been disarmed of the substance he uses to distract and disconnect himself. Distract and disconnect himself from a life he's extremely dissatisfied with. On the phone with his romantic partner, he's void of any enthusiasm for seeing her family and starting a family with her, but he continues to lifelessly walk through this life he hates. And after an incident with James, his career and even health is at risk, putting him completely at rock bottom. This is when he gives in to his vices, drinking with Justine and cheating on his partner. And I would never assume these narrative elements on Cregger's life directly. I don't know him personally, of course, but for anyone who loses someone, you can't help but reflect on your life in maybe a cynical way and feel some sort of gaping hole of emptiness. And I now want to move into James' character, but I want to use a quote from Alden Ehrenreich about his character Paul to transition us into that incident that he had with James in the film with the needle. You know, he meets James at a point where he's vulnerable in the sense that he's lost control of his own story, his own life. You know, when we're doing things that we didn't totally say yes to internally, or we're living lives that aren't exactly what we want, there's a feeling like you're a victim of life or the world or fate or something. And I think that's where he's at. And when he meets James, there's a way in which this is the worst possible thing he could have come across at this particular moment. And it drives him over the edge. So James represents the feeling of isolation and infection figuratively. When you suffer from a life-threatening addiction, like Cregger did and like James does, you may carry this feeling of believing your flaws and missteps are contagious, especially after something tragic happens to someone close, and you inevitably feel you're the one to blame for it. And such a feeling can lead to reclusive habits. It's almost like this emotional quarantine, which is symbolized by James' secluded lifestyle. A major theme in this film is the fear of infection, metaphorically. In countless instances, the ills and flaws of one character will be carried over to another character, or at the very least, drag another character down that first character came in contact with. Peppered throughout the film, there are these very subtle references to transmittable infection. For example, the parasites on Marcus's TV, or the lesson from Justine on infection. And of course, most obviously, Paul's anxiety around getting AIDS from James. And for every one of these characters, we have this ever-present looming figure in the background. So let's discuss our witch Gladys, as well as Marcus, Alex, and the ending of the film, in theme number 3, Spirit of Grief. So as mentioned before, our witch Gladys is present in the life of every character we meet in the film for good reason symbolically, because the witch represents the self-destructive habits, temptations, decisions, and substances that affect our lives and relationships when we encounter tragedy and hardship, most notably alcoholism. Gladys looms over our 6 characters like this demon spirit from hell that just gets closer and closer slowly, with a grasp that just slowly gets tighter and tighter. She carries a bell with 2 symbols on it, a triangle and a 6. While at first this looks like some sort of occultist combination of symbols, it's actually a little simpler than that. The triangle that we see, not only on the bell, but in the opening credit sequence and the end credit sequence, reflects the Alcoholics Anonymous symbol, a triangle inside a circle, most often seen in the color blue, as it is in the film. Alcohol is the central addictive substance in the film, and so much of this film is about our characters' battle with it, and most importantly, Zach's in real life. And it's critical to notice that the triangle on Gladys's bell is upside down, meaning it represents the inverse of what AA represents. Rather than supporting you to conquer your addiction, it's pulling you further and deeper into your addiction. Like alcoholism, Gladys's bell takes complete control of you before you know it, and you obey it like a master. And in the super unconventional way, in the credits, the names seem to revolve around the blue triangle, like our 6 characters revolve around the problems that come with addiction. And I'd love to tell you that the pointed arms of Marcus and all the children create the shape of this same triangle, and I would have interpreted it that way completely. But I learned in that Ringer Movies interview, Cregger just thought it looked cool and would confirm to the audience that something supernatural was behind the disappearances because it's so bizarre. As for the 6, the practical answer would be that we have 6 major characters who are each cast under the destructive spell of the witch and the real-life temptations associated with Gladys. But I'd also say the biblical and referential answer would be that in the Bible, the number 6 represents human imperfection, weakness, and sin. Everything this film explores very honestly and vulnerably between all 6 characters. And the effects of the witch are very well demonstrated symbolically in the dream sequences we see with Justine and with Archer. Justine gets up in the middle of the night, walks down the hall of her home that then turns into the hallway of the school. She walks into the class, sees Alex with his head down, and when she tries to get his attention, he lifts his head, revealing the clown makeup on his face. Justine returns to her bed and sees Gladys above her at her ceiling. I'll certainly go into more depth about Alex and his connection with alcoholism later in this video, but for now I just want to say that Alex wearing the clown makeup and Justine seeing Gladys at the ceiling represents the contagious and infectious nature of the witch's presence. Once Gladys and the consequences she represents reach Alex, they'll eventually get passed on to the classmates and then eventually get passed on to his teacher, Justine. And clown makeup often reflects shame and humiliation. When we or someone in our family is affected by alcohol abuse or addiction, there's this guilt and embarrassment involved that inclines us to keep our mouths shut, as Alex does in the dream and in reality. Archer also has his own nightmare sequence where he's sleeping in his son's bed and heads downstairs to see his son running away the night of the disappearance. He chases his son in a straight line, but somehow ends up at his own front door again. We covered this earlier, of course, discussing how it reflected the cyclical, false solution of chasing poorly proven guilty culprits. He's exhausting himself, running in circles in the real world. And in the dream, when he sees his son Matthew in bed, Matthew doesn't speak to him, again relating to the concept of shame, guilt, fear, and embarrassment. It also cruelly reflects Archer's continued emotional absence and inability to deeply connect and truly communicate with his son before his son went missing. And soon enough, Matthew turns into Gladys, again representing the contagiousness of her presence and the contagiousness of everything she represents. And if you thought I missed quite literally the biggest symbol in the film, the enormous assault rifle floating above the house, I just needed to save it so that I could smoothly transition into the title, which I will talk about right after, and kind of during the symbol too. The title of the film is Weapons, and the weapon floating above the house has the time of 2:17 on it. I don't think there's a weapon that better represents rage than an assault rifle. And the idea of targeting that rage at others to literally bring them down. This targeted rage, of course, stemming from this disappearance at 2:17. A targeted rage being manifested within the dream of the angriest and most resentful character. Even Archer's name is associated with targeting something and shooting at it. Archer even places a target on Justine when he paints the side of her car with the word witch, also subtly foreshadowing the real witch to come, Gladys. And the title of the film, being Weapons, relates to the symbol, of course, but also how we weaponize everything when we're at our lowest. We use the community as a weapon on our enemies. We use substances as a weapon on ourselves. We use people's history as a weapon against them. And when we use weapons, the only result is destruction and pain. And to carry through this feeling of destruction and pain on a very personal level, Zach uses this very bare, stripped down musical score, giving this cold feeling of vulnerability, weakness, and fear. The songs on the soundtrack are also incredibly melancholic, with tracks like George Harrison's Beware of Darkness and that opening sequence of the children running, with lyrics that warn against allowing illusion to get in the way of one's true purpose in life, or Dark End of the Street by Percy Sledge, about hiding our sins and wrongdoings, but inevitably paying the price for them in the end. And another stylistic choice to make things as personal and disorienting as possible, Zach and his cinematographer use a lot of over-the-shoulder and direct point-of-view camera work at every car window, house corner, and city street. And I know we still have two more characters to discuss, Marcus and Alex, so let's get into them. Marcus represents sacrifice, more specifically, irrational sacrifice, which is a major consequence of addiction. When we become addicted, we can turn on the ones we love, who only have our best interest in mind, like Marcus does to his partner once under Gladys' spell, beating his partner to death. And we sometimes sacrifice our professional career path and reputation when suffering from addiction, as Marcus, when under the spell, takes on the exact opposite image of who we knew him as at the beginning of the film. A highly empathetic and professional school principal. And finally, when it comes to Alex, I need to pull a quote from Zach Cregger himself, because this character might be the most directly reflective of him. To me, Weapons is not about the examination of societal malfunction. To me, it's more about my own personal stuff. The final chapter of this movie is very autobiographical. This is not a spoiler, but it's examining the dynamic of children with parents who are alcoholics, which is my childhood. And the idea of a foreign entity entering the household and inverting the dynamic between a child and the parents. The child feeding the parents soup and being a caretaker and that sort of thing. And Zach here kind of summed it up without spoiling the movie, so let's get into the specific details considering his explanation. So that foreign entity that he's talking about is the witch, Gladys. And Gladys, as we've spoken about before, represents the effects and consequences that revolve around addiction, like alcoholism, which relates to specifically Zach's father, who was an alcoholic. So you probably already get this, but Alex's parents' suffering reflects Zach's father's suffering and Zach's premature responsibility of having to take care of his father. And when Gladys tells Alex, go to school and take something personal from your classmates, that represents that a personal connection can transmit these viral setbacks that are a consequence of addiction, putting more and more people under the spell, either at the mercy of substance abuse directly or at the mercy of a loved one with substance abuse issues. And in the end, when just about all of these characters collide at the heart of their personal issues and addictions at Gladys at the house, we see that things can come to an end in many different ways. Some lose their lives, like Marcus, Paul, and James. Some are permanently compromised, like Alex's incapacitated parents. Some manage to detach from destructive relationships, symbolized by Justine shooting Paul, and some manage to mend broken relationships, like Archer with Justine and his son. But like Alex in the film, and like Zach in reality, it takes a particular level of will and character to break the cycle, as Alex breaks the stick to free his family, his peers, and his community. And Zach breaks the line of alcoholism from parent to child. And once such a cycle is broken, the new generation can overcome their greatest demons, as the children literally tear Gladys apart. And in the final line of the film, the little girl narrator returns to say that some of the children get to speak again. A bittersweet conclusion to remind us that even after the cycle is broken, the mental, physical, and psychological effects may live with us. And it's in the decisions we make moving forward to keep these demons beneath us. All right, this is my analysis. I'm super excited to hear your thoughts, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and see you later.